Hello, everyone. Welcome to the very first episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past the honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I thought, for the very first episode in this series, I would get off to a roaring start by focusing on the most obscure figure in this entire series. Nothing captivates a new audience by wallowing in obscurity. And if that isn't bad enough, I want to have a short prologue about the nature of history before we even get to the life and times of our first great. But hang with me, because while few people have heard of Sargon the Great, just about everyone knows the area from which he hailed. It was crucial in the development of human civilization. I am, of course, talking about Mesopotamia, that ancient land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Mesopotamia has often been called the cradle of civilization. One of the ironies of the name Mesopotamia is that it actually comes from the Greeks. The name means the country between two rivers in ancient Greek. The irony, of course, is that Mesopotamian societies long predate the Greek culture that would pop up a few millennia later to give them their handle. Today, historians use the term Near East for that corner of the globe, at least when referring to the societies of antiquity. Whatever we call it, Mesopotamia is inarguably critical for the human story. For hundreds, maybe thousands of years, it has been believed that Mesopotamia gave rise to the world's first writing and agricultural systems, that this is where our nomadic ancestors first stopped their wanderings and began to enjoy the sedentary trappings of urban life. Like most things with history, this is a best guess based on available evidence, and even this guess is subject to change when new information presents itself. For example, in the 1960s, archaeologists discovered a remarkable site in southern Turkey, now called Göbekli Tepe. The site has elaborate stoneworks, carvings, pillars, cisterns, stone quarries, and all sorts of attributes that mark this as a complex inhabited settlement. Of note to our story, it's old. Very old. 11,500 years old. That makes Göbekli Tepe 6,500 years older than the Great Pyramids of Egypt. The site is the oldest known place of worship anywhere on Earth. Just as the Mesopotamians long predate the Greeks, so too do the builders of Göbekli Tepe seem to predate the Mesopotamians. What, you might ask, is the point? The reason to bring this up is to put it in contrast with Mesopotamia. They can't both be the first place humans developed cities or material culture or places of worship or whatever. In fact, it's possible that neither place can claim such a distinction. We're always one shovelful of earth, one weird protruding rock, one planned highway through a seemingly empty expanse away from pushing the time frames back just a little bit further. The sense of the possible, the wonder over what else lies beneath, waiting to be discovered, to add a new chapter to the story, it gets me really fired up. It makes me want to grab a shovel and dig up my own backyard. Humans like clear definitions and absolutes. We like labels such as first, oldest, biggest, best, and of course, great. So as we meet our first subject, and we recall the penchant for declarative labels, let's remember Göbekli Tepe, and that what we know, in this case, what little we know, rests on a tenuous foundation of evidence. But for now, Sargon of Akkad is often called the first person in history to rule an empire, and for this, history remembers him as Sargon the Great. As far as this humble podcaster can tell, Sargon is the oldest historical figure with the epithet of the Great. Now, if he was the first to rule an empire, by definition, no one could have done it before him. But that doesn't mean he just materialized out of thin air. This is where our project gets a little tricky. The history of Mesopotamian peoples is exceedingly complex. There are early cultures, some of which we know a good deal about, some that are quite shadowy. As the series progresses, and you all get to know me a little bit better, you'll discover that I like to pay attention to marginal details. I know I said this in the intro, but if you're one of those people that skips the intro, I want you to be forewarned. I do recommend listening to it, though, because it's where we lay out exactly what we're trying to do here. Anyway, as for me trying to will myself to focus, this is one of those times. We have to pick a starting point, and by extension, to deliberately choose to leave off some information and some entire civilizations that are deeply interesting in their own right, and just, well, get started. With that in mind, we're going to do a very brief introduction to the Sumerians. The earliest known civilization in Mesopotamia, the Sumerians enter the historical record between the 6th and 5th millennia BCE. As an aside, I know I do a lot of asides, but stick with me. I always struggle with BCE dates. For some reason, it's hard for me to count down, so to speak. Moving forward in time just feels like the number should go up too. So when I screw this up, take it easy on me. Again, anyway, the Sumerians. They lived on the banks of the mighty Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They developed canal-based irrigation systems and were able to produce abundant harvests. This surplus allowed people to settle down. Urbanization kicked in, and with it, specialized labor and political hierarchy. Settlements on the rivers grew into cities. The Sumerians built elaborate trade networks, exporting fruits, grains, and textiles in exchange for luxury goods like cedar and alabaster. For their time, they were a remarkably advanced people. For that matter, they were pretty incredible for any time. In many ways, the Sumerians were far more advanced than, say, the Gothic or Celtiberian tribes roaming Europe 5,000 or 6,000 years later. Sumerian culture spread across a variety of city-states in the southern area between the Tigris and Euphrates. However, that did not mean that they had a single consolidated political structure. Much like the Greeks many are familiar with, political power was held in the cities, and those cities often got at one another's throats. Sumeria, in other words, was a culture, but not a kingdom, and they liked to brawl with each other. That began to change when an ambitious Sumerian king named Lugalzaggisi began his project of consolidating the power of the region into an integrated, centrally controlled polity. In this project, he was largely successful, bringing more than 50 cities under his banner. This centralization of political authority across a wide territory was a novel political innovation, at least as far as we can tell. But not everyone was thrilled with this consolidation. Up north, still between the two rivers, was a closely related peoples, the Akkadians. They shared a lot of cultural similarities, and like the Sumerians, the Akkadians organized their society around city-states. The Akkadians did speak a different language from an entirely different language family, the Semitic languages, and seemed to view themselves as a distinct people. The Sumerians and the Akkadians eyed one another with a hint of suspicion. One of the rules of Akkadian society was, apparently, priestesses were forbidden to have children, and sometime around 2354 BCE, one such priestess gave birth to a baby boy. Not wanting to suffer the consequences, she put the baby in a basket and set it adrift on the Euphrates, making little Sargon the first baby abandoned in a basket on a river legend recorded in history. He certainly wouldn't be the last, with the biblical patriarch Moses and legendary founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus, among those that would follow in due time. Intriguingly, and not to skip ahead too far, but one of Sargon's eventual sons would go by the name Remush, which sounds a lot like Remus, an historical echo that reverberated for millennia. But back to the plot. The baby in the basket was soon found by a poor local Akkadian worker who raised the boy as his own son. He trained this boy to follow in the family trade, working as a palace gardener for Ur-Zababa, the local king of Kish, a city at the southern borderlands between Sumeria and Akkadia. This was a fortuitous vocation for the orphan boy. The king quickly recognized the boy's intelligence and talent, and eventually brought Sargon into his inner circle, appointing him to the distinguished post of cupbearer. In the ancient world, when fear of poison was rife, the cupbearer, someone who literally handed the king their cup, had to be of unshakable trust and loyalty. It would be so easy to slip something into the king's drink. To be the cupbearer was more than a task. It was an indication of profound trust and favor from the king. It's not clear what brought Sargon to power. In an ancient text known as the Sargon legend, Ur-Zababa grew fearful of the growing power and talent of his young bureaucrat. In the legend, he sends Sargon on near-suicidal diplomatic missions with the hidden intention of having Sargon die for the effort. But Sargon manages to survive, unaware of his master's devious intentions. In the final mission, Sargon is to bring a sealed message directly to the Sumerian overlord, Lugalzaggisi. And that message asked Lugalzaggisi to kill Sargon. Much of this text is lost. The legend is incomplete. Clearly, Sargon made it through unscathed, somehow managing to accomplish his diplomatic mission, avoid death by betrayal, and rise to take the place of his duplicitous king. It feels as though this story was crafted to justify Sargon's eventual usurpation of power. After all, if he'd been nobly and loyally serving his king, and that king was duplicitously plotting to have him killed, then wouldn't Sargon have been justified in overthrowing the tyrant? The Sargon legend reeks of propagandist justification, not just for his seizure of power, but also to set the stage for his eventual showdown with Lugalzaggisi. But that's a bit down the road. There is another interpretation of Sargon's looming rise to power. According to some other historical analysis, it was only the aggression of Lugalzaggisi that led to Sargon's rise. There's some indication that, not content with ruling all over Sumeria, Lugalzaggisi wanted to keep pushing north into Akkadia. He invaded Kish as part of his expansionist program and in the process toppled Ur-Zababa, with Sargon assuming the kingship in the aftermath. Legends and historical interpretations offer clues, but it is not ultimately known how Sargon came to be king. Whatever went down, Sargon eventually became the king, not just of Kish, but of all of the Akkadian people. As with his rise to power, his consolidation of the Akkadians into a unified people is also not known. Did he undertake a project of forced integration with the Akkadians, similar to the one that Lugalzaggisi did with the Sumerians? There doesn't seem to be much record of a conquest. It's also possible that the Akkadians, aware of the hostile threat posed by Lugalzaggisi, turned to Sargon as the leader of their resistance. This seems a valid scenario, Akkadian centralization happening as a response to Sumerian aggression. If that's the case, it was a wise decision. Once again, it's hard to know the truth. One thing was clear, though. A showdown between Sargon and Lugalzaggisi loomed. Incidentally, his birth name could not have been Sargon, because the name translates from the Akkadian to something akin to the legitimate king, which means he was not a completely legitimate king. It sounds like, in his name, Sargon was protesting a bit. But perhaps Sargon's title reflects less his usurpation of the king, or some other questionable Caesar of power, and more the fact that he hailed from peasant stock, with no nobility or affiliation to a royal line anywhere to be found. Lacking one, Sargon seems to have invented a backstory, including being the son of a priestess. Anyone of peasant origins would struggle to find acceptance in the upper crust of an oligarchic society dominated by snobbish nobles, in Akkadia, Sumeria, and for that matter, just about any civilization anywhere ever. It's also possible that the abandoned in a basket story was likewise an invention to give him retroactive legitimacy. That guy over there? Nah, he's not my dad. He just found me floating on a basket. My mom, she was a priestess. Either way, since he had no legitimate claim to the throne, he did the natural thing and put legitimate right into his name. Between his name and the Sargon legend, it seems likely that he was a usurper in one form or another, either by toppling Ur-Zababa or jumping to the head of the line when Ur-Zababa got tossed aside by Lugalzaggisi. No matter how he got control of power, he sure took advantage of it. Once in charge, he faced a huge crisis. Lugalzaggisi showed no signs of halting his expansion, and Sargon didn't have the ability to stand up to his bullying neighbor. He needed some time and space to sort things out. With Lugalzaggisi entrenched in his Sumerian power base, Sargon's capital of Kish was a little too close for comfort. It was possibly already under Sumerian hegemony. Shrewdly, he moved his capital north, establishing the city of Agad, or Akkad, from which we get Akkadian, making his capital and embarking on a similar project of intercultural consolidation as his neighbor to the south. This move to Agad gave Sargon the opportunity to have a little distance between himself and his rival, and he used this to his advantage. He raised troops, equipped them with the latest weaponry, and drilled them on battlefield tactics. This itself was a departure from the standard military practices of the day, which eschewed professional or standing armies in favor of conscripts led by local nobility on an as-needed basis. Traditionally, fighting was seasonal, with all sides penciling their playdates around harvest time so that the labor needed to secure a food supply took primacy over any armed conflict. The idea of having a group of people dedicated specifically to warfare was an innovation. This created more people that needed to be fed, supplied, clothed, housed, armed, all at the expense of the state, while simultaneously removing capable laborers from the labor pool used to accomplish all those things. It's either a sign of the overall prosperity of the region that Sargon could afford to create an army, or of his desperation to fend off the threat of Lugalzaggisi, or both. But Sargon's force is the first known standing army in history. There are a lot of firsts with this guy. With his new army, equipped, trained, and ready to fight whenever and wherever they pleased, Sargon felt a surge of confidence. Or at least he sure acted like he did. Sargon was ambitious. His rival to the south, however, was more powerful. Lugalzaggisi had a veteran, battle-tested army and a much bigger territory from which to draw resources. Sargon, demonstrating a level of foresight and pragmatism that would contribute to his reputation for greatness, did not immediately take his new army south to confront Lugalzaggisi directly. Rather, he turned his back on Sumeria and took his army north, away from Sumeria, and instead taking and sacking the Assyrian city of Ashur and generally conquering anything in the northern lands between the two mighty rivers. He got off to a roaring start, immediately adding territory to his control. What's more, given that the Assyrians were not exactly friendly, and we will talk a lot about them in upcoming episodes, Sargon's subjugation of them prevented a hostile enemy from operating in his rear in the eventuality that he had to face down the Sumerians to the south. Showing measured patience, despite dominating an even bigger region, and thus appropriating all the resources of his newly conquered lands, Sargon still eschewed a fight with Lugalzaggisi. Having subdued the region to his north, he next turned east into what is now Iran and confronted the wild hill tribes in the area called Gwitam. He was securing all his borders before the big fight. With his north and east pacified, Sargon made his first foray into Sumeria, turning west and seizing the strategic city of Lagash, south of Lugalzaggisi's capital of Umma. He didn't stay long, however. Before Lugalzaggisi could march to confront his upstart neighbor, Sargon left just as quickly as he came. He did leave behind a garrison to defend the city should Lugalzaggisi try to reclaim it. Then, Sargon continued his westward crossing of Sumeria and marched all the way into Anatolia and modern Turkey. Take a moment and think about what Sargon had accomplished militarily, even before his big showdown with Lugalzaggisi. He started his campaign with a more powerful and decidedly hostile neighbor to his south. Before any confrontation, Sargon built the world's first professional army and trained it relentlessly. When it was good and ready, he led this army to secure his northern and eastern borders, pried away a key city in his rival's heartland, then went out to subdue people to his west, northeast-west. He essentially encircled his rival, all while building his power base, while at the same time straining the Sumerians' elaborate and lucrative trade networks. He made himself stronger and weakened his enemy even before a direct confrontation. Sargon began his crusades as the weaker belligerent. By the time he was ready to take on Lugalzaggisi, he controlled a massive swathe of territory, had a veteran and likewise battle-tested army, had refined his combat tactics, and boxed his enemy in. In the course of his campaigns, Sargon had matured into a shrewd and cunning strategist. Lugalzaggisi was in trouble. But before Lugalzaggisi could personally lead his troops to face his upstart neighbor, Sargon launched a lightning invasion of Sumeria and aimed straight for the key city of Erech. The city quickly fell. Its garrison fled and attempted to reorganize, while Sargon destroyed Erech's city walls. While a panicked Lugalzaggisi rushed to get to the theater of war, the Sumerian army regrouped and squared off again against Sargon's forces. Sargon obliterated the Sumerians in a subsequent battle. Only then did Lugalzaggisi arrive on the scene to take command of the situation. By then, his kingdom was already reeling, his armies bleeding. But finally, at long last, Sargon and Lugalzaggisi squared off, toe-to-toe. In their confrontation, Sargon's army annihilated their Sumerian counterparts, and Lugalzaggisi was captured. The king was led away in chains, fated to suffer ritual humiliation. The once mighty ruler of all Sumeria was paraded in front of Sargon's subjects, spat upon, ridiculed, humiliated. The capture of Lugalzaggisi by Sargon is enshrined in a stele, on display in the Louvre. If you're in Paris, you can go see it for yourself. Now, there's no record of Lugalzaggisi's exact fate, but somehow, I doubt Sargon would have magnanimously allowed his defeated foe to enjoy a quiet exile. Down the line, Persian kings developed the idea that to physically possess a defeated king was to enhance their own prestige. But that's a few thousand years away. And as of this time in the historical record, we've heard no more of Lugalzaggisi from this point forward. He vanishes. Without their overlord, what was left of the Sumerian resistance could do little to stem the Akkadian momentum. Sargon marched his troops all the way to the Persian Gulf, slicing their way through the heart of Sumeria and bringing every Sumerian city under the Akkadian yoke. When they got to the coast, the Akkadian soldiers ritually washed their weapons in the Great Sea, symbolically conquering the ocean and land alike. But ancient conquest was nothing new. City-states and cultures fought and feuded all the time. What Sargon did in achieving victory might have been larger in scale than contemporaries, but there was nothing novel about being a conqueror in and of itself. It's really what came after these martial victories that truly sets Sargon apart. Most ancient warfare resulted in slaughter and pillage. Cities razed, citizens slaughtered or taken or sold into slavery, women raped, priests kills, sacred spaces defiled, anything movable stolen. Sargon wanted to conquer, yes, but he also wanted to rule. Defying the conventions of his day, or for that matter, most of human history both before and after, Sargon did not destroy the vanquished cities. After pulling down their city walls to prevent their rebellion, he more or less left them intact. He'd displace or execute some local leaders, but for the most part, he left the citizens alone, as long as they paid their taxes, and in doing so, he ushered in a new era of peace, albeit a peace won and maintained at the tip of a spear. Sargon even adopted the worship of the local Sumerian gods, rebuilt their palaces, and made a grand show of piety to Sumerian beliefs. In short, Sargon united differing ethnic and linguistic kingdoms between the Tigris and Euphrates into a single, centrally controlled polity, and along with it, built a multi-faith and multi-ethnic empire. But ambition is ambition, and despite overwhelming and swallowing the rival Sumerians, Sargon had this nice, unbeatable juggernaut of an army, and well, it'd be a shame not to use it, right? After settling affairs in Mesopotamia, Sargon turned east, subduing the region known as Elam in today's southwestern Iran. He plundered the rich city of Susa, sealing its treasure. But don't feel too bad for the Elamites, though, because in about 1,000 years, they will become the dominant rulers and empire builders in the Near East. Continuing his here and there campaigns, Sargon next went back west, capturing Syria and Lebanon, and even piling his army onto boats to invade Cyprus in one of the earliest, if not the very first, amphibious assaults. From the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, Sargon built a massive empire. He'd come a long way from a humble palace gardener, but perhaps those horticultural roots still had sway in his psyche, as he collected plant specimens from his foreign conquests and sent them back to be cultivated in his city of Akkad. One of the perhaps unexpected beneficiaries of Sargon's conquests were the Sumerians themselves. Before Sargon, the city-states that made up Sumeria spent considerable energy and manpower fighting one another. Under the banner of their Akkadian conqueror, these squabbles abruptly stopped. This brought a new wave of prosperity. Trade and economic development boomed. Sumeria became richer than ever. The prosperity was not restricted to the conquered lands of Sumeria. Sargon's capital of Akkad grew extremely wealthy, with an abundance of adornments and luxury goods, and thanks to Sargon's horticultural collections, perhaps one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Once the conquests were completed, the Akkadian Empire seems to have been largely peaceful. According to legend, Sargon ruled for an extremely fruitful 55 years. Little is known of the circumstances of his death, although it's hard to believe that he was not greatly mourned by his people, or, that is, by his Akkadian people. For on his death, his successors had to contend with a series of Sumerian uprisings. The Sumerians, it seemed, valued their independence more than their newfound riches, and they rose up in revolt. These cycles of revolt and suppression would sap both the Sumerians and the Akkadians. Sargon's successor almost lost the whole empire. The Akkadians had a considerable revival under Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, who, channeling the spirit of his grandfather, went out a-conquerin'. Naram-Sin stitched the empire back together and embarked on a campaign to memorialize his victories on his own monumental steles. Naram-Sin was recognized, in his day and in our own, as a worthy successor of his grandfather, but, as with Sargon, Naram-Sin's immediate successors would struggle to hold it all together, and about a century after Naram-Sin, the Akkadian Empire collapsed. This power vacuum would be filled by various groups for thousands of years, but even as the kingdoms and empires rose and fell, all considered the example of Sargon. His empire lasted roughly 200 years. In the grand sweep of things, this is but the bat of an eye. But the impact of Sargon and the empire he formed, his political and military innovations, continued to reverberate for thousands of years. Besides, we shouldn't hold it against Sargon that the Akkadian Empire didn't last a long, long time. No ruler can control events after they die, and eventually, they all die. So how do we weigh up Sargon? He did something that no one else had ever done. He created an empire. But wait, what about the guy he ended, Lugalzaggisi, the Sumerian king that brought all the Sumerian city-states under his banner? Wasn't that an empire? The distinction made by historians is that Sargon's conquest brought him dominion over multiple cultures, people with different languages, laws, customs, religious practices, etc. Lugalzaggisi managed to unite most of Sumeria under his rule. What makes Sargon unique, and to many historians great, is that, so far as we can tell, he was the first person to integrate different peoples into united polity, to be centrally governed. Still, it's always worth noting that what is often described as a novel innovation is less something completely new and more of an advance or an improvement on concepts and ideas long under development. For a modern example, Thomas Edison didn't exactly invent the light bulb. Other people had been working on similar ideas for a long time. He just did it better than all of his predecessors, so his advance in the technology became synonymous with the technology itself. Empire was Sargon's light bulb, so to speak. He ruled for a remarkably long time, 55 years according to some of the sources. Trade and economy boomed, culture thrived, the Akkadian language spread throughout the Near East, becoming the lingua franca of Mesopotamia for a long, long time. He ushered in all sorts of legal, political, military, and agricultural innovations. Here's an example. One of the interesting aspects of Sargon's government structure was the role of royal daughters. He is fortunate to have many capable daughters, and he appointed several to key priestly functions. Temples served both as places of worship and administrative centers, so having his family control these dual functions furthered his control on the apparatus of state. By melding church and state, Sargon developed the concept of a god king. Other royal daughters were married to governors or key political allies, cementing the ties of loyalty between Sargon and the other important figures in Akkadian society. Marriage as a tool to forge political alliances would become standard practice as the concept of empire further developed, but it was novel at the time. The empire he built, which stretched from modern Iran into modern Turkey, was so big that it would take a full 1,000 years before another empire of its size would rise. We can't know, but we can reasonably infer that he must have been an effective administrator, a gifted strategist, and the kind of leader that engendered deep loyalty from his inner circle. Still, for all his accomplishments, he's a difficult guy to know. Little of his personality, what he was like, how he carried himself, his leadership style, makes it through to us. We're left to imagine. Most of what we know of Sargon comes from carvings and inscriptions, some of which seem to date from his reign, but many of which point to a later authorship. In some cases, much later. Correspondence and inscriptions were abundant in the Near Eastern world. Some of these, mostly fragmentary, survive to this day. Countless more have been lost to the sands of time. Many of the inscriptions that convey these stories and possible legends that make up our understanding of Sargon seem to have been written long after his rule, in some cases by ambitious rulers keen to associate themselves with him. It's impossible to know just how much mythologizing crept into these inscriptions. Just look to our own times for an example of this tendency. George Washington had been dead for less than a decade before the absurdity of "I cannot tell a lie, I chopped down that cherry tree," evolved from an absurd fabrication by an author more interested in selling books than being historically accurate to a generally accepted reality. It's taken centuries to unwind that one. Still, what is certain is that in his own time and long after, Sargon remained in the collective memory, and his life and rule were seen as epochal. It should tell us something. For hundreds, even thousands of years, ambitious rulers sought to gain from association with Sargon. But when did he start to be seen as great? It's tough to tell when Sargon started to be called the Great. Who knows if the Akkadians even had such a term for a concept in their time? One scenario by which Sargon came to enjoy his title is that it is a more recent naming convention, as nearly 2 millennia later, a Neo-Assyrian king, wishing to evoke the grandeur of an illustrious predecessor, took Sargon as his regnal name, and historians refer to our guy as the Great, and the subsequent Assyrian king as Sargon II to differentiate the two. One wonders if the other guy struggled with legitimacy as well. Sargon is so old that it's hard to be sure when he got his title, but no matter what, did he earn it? At the start of this episode, I spent way too long rambling about the subjective nature of claims to primacy, that this was the first city or that was the first writing system. Sargon is the first person that we know of to have ruled an empire. So for now, his title is secure. It would take some incredible discovery for someone to come along and knock him off the throne. But hey, even if that happens, Sargon had a good run. 4,300 years, give or take, is a long time to be ranked number one. And if that doesn't make someone great, then I don't know what does. I hope you've enjoyed the first episode in the Greats of History. Join us on the next episode when we get to know a ruler who might just be the most distinguished in the long, long history of one of humanity's greatest civilizations, the Egyptians.